On Christmas night, my daughter smiled tenderly and raised a glass of champagne to toast my health in front of the neighbors. But she had no idea that I had already seen what was hidden at the bottom of her designer handbag. A forged medical evaluation certifying that I had lost mental capacity, along with a power of attorney document that would strip away every asset I had built my entire life. She wanted to push me into a run-down nursing home so she could sell off this mansion. She thought she had set the perfect trap for a senile old man. So I decided to play along with her performance. I signed that paper with a trembling hand. But what I left behind for her and her husband 10 days later was a financial death sentence with no way back. Before we dive into the brutal secret of that night, please hit the subscribe button and leave a comment telling me, where are you watching this video from and what time is it right now? Now, let's go back to the moment I picked up that pen and made the most ruthless move of my entire life. My name is Osgood Fenn. I'm 68 years old, and for 41 years I was an architect, the kind who signed his name in the corner of blueprints for towers that still stand along the Chicago skyline. The kind who once believed that if you built something well enough, it would outlast every betrayal life could ever throw at you. I was wrong about that. I learned in the space of one single afternoon that the only structure I had never properly inspected in my entire career was the one closest to me, my own family. For the past 10 years, I had lived in the guest house behind the main estate, a converted carriage house of 900 square feet, with a small kitchen and a bedroom that still smelled faintly of the cedar I'd insisted on when I renovated it with my own hands. The main house, the real house, a 7,200 square foot colonial sitting on 2.5 manicured acres in one of the wealthiest pockets of the Chicago suburbs, belonged to my daughter, Genevra, and her husband, Rhett. I had bought the entire property outright, in cash, 10 years earlier, for $20,500 to save a marriage that was drowning in debt before it had even finished its second year. I told myself back then that it was a gift born entirely of love. Rhett had lost his position at a private equity firm under circumstances he never fully explained to me. Genevra had come to me in tears, clutching a stack of overdue notices, saying she couldn't bear to lose the life she'd only just started building for herself. I remember standing in my old kitchen, looking at my daughter's face. Margaret's eyes, Margaret's stubborn chin, the same eyes and chin I'd loved since the day she was born. And I remember thinking with absolute certainty, the way you're certain about a load calculation before you've even opened the file. What is money for, if not for this? Margaret, my wife, had been gone for 6 years by then, taken suddenly by a stroke that gave us no warning and no time to say any of the things people are supposed to say to each other before the end. In the years after she died, I filled the silence in my life with usefulness. I paid for Genevra's landscaping. I paid the private school tuition for a grandson I rarely got to see. I paid off Rhett's credit cards twice, quietly, without ever once mentioning it at dinner. I told myself I was simply being a good father, doing what any father with the means would do. What I did not understand, not until much later, not until it was almost too late, was that I was slowly, patiently teaching them both that my only true purpose in their lives was to be used. The moment everything changed began with something almost absurdly small, a broken security camera. Rhett had installed a set of Ring cameras around the main house 2 years earlier, after a string of package thefts swept through the neighborhood. One of them, mounted above the back terrace, had apparently stopped transmitting a week before Thanksgiving. Rhett mentioned it once at dinner, visibly annoyed, saying he'd get around to replacing it eventually, the way he said that about most things that weren't directly in front of him. I offered to look at it myself. Fixing things with my own 2 hands had always been the only therapy that ever truly worked for me, ever since Margaret died, and Rhett simply waved his hand and said, "Sure, old man, have at it," in that particular tone he always used with me. Half affectionate, half dismissive, The tone you use with an old dog that still thinks it's useful around the house. It wasn't broken at all. It was simply unplugged. The cable knocked loose behind a decorative planter someone had shifted while trimming the hedges. When I reconnected it, the camera's storage application on my tablet automatically began syncing an entire week of backlogged audio and video that had been quietly recording locally the whole time, unbeknownst to anyone in that house, including Rhett himself. I only meant to check that the picture was clear. Instead, sitting alone in my little guest house that evening with a cup of chamomile tea going cold beside me, I listened to the last 7 days of my daughter's life play back to me in her own voice. What I heard was not an argument. It was a plan, laid out with the calm, methodical precision of two people who had clearly rehearsed it more than once before, refining it the way you'd refine a business pitch. Rhett's gambling debts, it turned out, were not the modest, embarrassing sort I had assumed and quietly forgiven over the years without ever saying so out loud. They were catastrophic. Over $340,000 owed to a private lender whose name Rhett spoke in a hushed, frightened voice I had never once heard him use before, not in 15 years of knowing him. Genevra's response was not shock. It was strategy, delivered flatly, the way you'd describe a spreadsheet. "We have the house," she said. "We have Dad. We just need him declared incompetent before that lender comes looking for collateral." I sat perfectly still, the tablet trembling slightly in my scarred hands that had poured concrete, gripped steel beams, held blueprints against the wind on 100 job sites across 40 years. And I listened to my only child describe, in clinical, almost bored detail, the architecture of my own destruction. They had already begun. For nearly 3 weeks, Genevra had been dissolving low-dose sleeping tablets into my evening tea, just enough to leave me groggy and disoriented each following morning. Episodes I had genuinely mistaken for the ordinary forgetfulness of growing older, the kind you laugh off at breakfast. They had already paid a private physician, a man named Dr. Sylvester Kane, whose practice apparently specialized in exactly this kind of arrangement, $15,000 to produce a falsified cognitive assessment diagnosing me with early-stage dementia. Their goal was a full power of attorney, obtained under the appearance of my own free consent, which would let them commit me to a state-subsidized nursing facility. Rhett actually used the word warehouse on the recording, and laughed when he said it, and liquidate the entire estate to settle the debt before the lender's associates arrived with far less patient methods of collection. "He'll go quietly," Genevra said on the recording, in a voice I did not recognize as belonging to the little girl who used to fall asleep in my arms during long car rides to visit her grandparents in Wisconsin. "He's always gone quietly. That's the whole point of him." I sat with that single sentence for a very long time after the recording ended. That's the whole point of him. 41 years of providing, 10 years of paying for this exact house, every tuition check, every quiet bailout, every Christmas where I gave more than I ever received and simply called it love. And in my own daughter's own words, spoken so easily, without a second's hesitation, my entire value to her had been reduced to one single function: the man who goes quietly. I did not cry, though I fully expected to. What arrived instead was something colder, something I had never once felt toward Genevra in 42 years of being her father. It arrived the way winter arrives in Chicago. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once. A hard freeze settling over everything that used to feel warm and taking its time about melting again. I thought of Margaret. I thought of something she used to say to me decades earlier, whenever a contractor tried to undercut our budget or a neighbor asked one favor too many. "Osgood," she would say, resting her hand gently on my forearm, her voice low and certain, "don't ever let your kindness become your weakness." I had nodded along for years without truly understanding her, filing it away as one of her small sayings. That night, alone in the guest house, with a recording of my own daughter's voice still echoing in my ears, I finally completely understood exactly what she'd meant. I could confront them. I could scream, demand answers, call the police, expose the fraudulent doctor, end it that same night in one blaze of righteous fury. Some part of me, the part that had loved Genevra unconditionally for 42 years, wanted exactly that. But rage is a blunt instrument, and I had spent my entire career learning that the strongest structures are never built in anger. They are built in silence, with precise calculation, load-bearing wall by load-bearing wall, inspected twice before a single beam is trusted. They wanted to play a game with a foolish old man who would sign whatever piece of paper was placed in front of him. Very well. I decided, sitting there in the dark with my cold tea and my daughter's betrayal still humming in my ears, that I would give them exactly the man they were expecting. I would smile, I would tremble, I would forget names on cue and lose my keys on schedule right down to the day. But I would be the one who decided when the game ended, and I would be the one who decided the terms of their surrender. They thought they had found their perfect mark. An easy, fading old man ready to be led quietly out the back door of his own life. They had no idea they had just woken up the architect. The morning after I heard that recording, I woke before dawn and began building the second self I would need to survive what was coming. I stood in front of the small mirror in my guest house bathroom and practiced, of all things, forgetting. I practiced the slight hesitation before a familiar name. I practiced the faint tremor in my right hand, the one I would later carry deliberately into every cup of tea, every handshake, every signature. 41 years of reading blueprints had taught me that the difference between an amateur and a master is always in the details. Nobody else bothers to notice. I intended to be a master of this particular blueprint too, more careful than I had ever been about anything in my professional life. At breakfast that same morning, I called Rhett Grant, a name that meant nothing to anyone in the house, a name I had invented purely for its unfamiliarity, the kind of small, deliberate error that lands harder than a big one. He blinked, mildly annoyed, and corrected me. I apologized, looking appropriately confused, my eyes drifting for a beat too long toward the window, my fork hovering uncertainly over my plate. Genevra's eyes flicked toward her husband with a small, satisfied glimmer that she thought I hadn't caught. I caught everything now. That was the strange, bitter gift hidden inside betrayal. Once you know exactly where to look for the knife, you finally start noticing precisely where every single knife in a house is kept. Over the following 2 weeks, I gave a performance that even now I am quietly proud of. I misplaced my keys 3 separate times, always in places just plausible enough to be believed. The refrigerator, the mailbox, the pocket of a coat I hadn't worn in days. I let my hand shake visibly whenever I lifted a teacup that Genevra herself had prepared, careful each time to tip the liquid discreetly into a potted fern by the window the instant she left the room, watching it drain into the soil like a small private act of defiance. I stopped correcting Rhett when he interrupted me mid-sentence, stopped finishing my own thoughts out loud, let long silences hang where a sharper man would have filled them instantly. I watched my daughter's confidence bloom in real time, day by day, like a plant given exactly the wrong kind of sunlight and thriving on it anyway. I watched her stop lowering her voice around me entirely, the way people stop being careful around a locked door they already believe they hold the only key to. "He's getting worse," I overheard her tell Rhett one evening, standing just outside the kitchen, while I sat, apparently absorbed in nothing, in the darkened living room, a blanket over my knees I did not need. Faster than I thought. This is actually going to be easier than we planned, honestly. Easier than we planned. I let those words settle into my chest like wet concrete being poured into a foundation trench, cold and permanent, and quietly hardening into something I would never let melt again. Good, I thought, keeping my face perfectly, deliberately blank. Let it feel easy for you a little while longer. Let the ease make you careless. But performance alone would not save the house, or the 10 years of my life poured into its foundation, or the promise I had quietly renewed to Margaret every single night since her death, the promise that I would not let anyone, not even our own daughter, turn everything the two of us had built together into a weapon aimed back at me. I understood from decades of contract negotiations that Illinois law does not move quickly for an elderly man trying to reclaim property from family members who can simply stand in front of any judge and claim they are protecting a vulnerable, confused parent. A standard eviction proceeding against a relative, especially one already holding a signed power of attorney, could stretch on for a year or longer, tangled endlessly in exactly the kind of sympathetic narrative Genevra was already rehearsing for the neighbors at every dinner party she hosted. I needed something faster than the courts, something that did not depend on any judge's mercy at all, something that removed the question of mercy from the equation entirely. 3 days after I first heard that recording, while Genevra and Rhett believed I was sedated and sleeping soundly in the guest house after my evening tea, I slipped out the back door in the dark, walked 6 blocks through the freezing cold to the edge of the subdivision, and called for a ride into downtown Chicago. Foster Whitaker's office occupied the 26th floor of a glass tower on LaSalle Street, the kind of building whose structural engineering I could have recited from memory without glancing at a single drawing. Foster and I had known each other for nearly 20 years, ever since he handled a contract dispute for one of my old construction partnerships. He had built a quiet, formidable trusts and estates practice since then, precisely the sort of lawyer wealthy families hire, because he never once needs to raise his voice to win. He listened to the entire recording in complete silence, his expression sliding slowly from professional courtesy into something closer to genuine horror. When it finally ended, he set down his pen and studied me for a long moment before speaking. "Osgood," he said at last, "legally, you cannot simply throw them out tomorrow. Not cleanly. If she's already positioning herself as your caregiver, any hasty eviction attempt could be spun in front of a judge as elder abandonment or retaliation. She could delay this for a year, maybe longer, all while living in your house rent-free and quietly building sympathy with every relative and neighbor who will listen to her version of events." "Then tell me what will work," I said, "because I am done, completely done, being patient with people who mistake patience for stupidity." Foster leaned back in his chair, and for the first time that morning, something like a small smile crossed his face. Not amusement exactly, but the particular satisfaction of a craftsman who has just been handed an interesting problem worth solving properly. "We stop thinking like a father defending a house," he said, "and we start thinking like a corporation protecting an asset. We move the entire property, and every account tied to it, into an irrevocable trust today. Immediately. The moment the transfer is legally recorded, Osgood Fenn personally owns nothing they could ever take from you again. Any power of attorney they later coerce you into signing would apply to a man who legally owns nothing whatsoever. It would not be delayed by a courtroom. It would be worthless from the moment the ink dries." We spent the next 4 hours in his office building it, line by line, clause by clause. The trust would be called Larkhaven Holdings, LLC, managed by an independent asset trustee with no personal ties to my family whatsoever, insulated specifically against exactly the kind of coercion my daughter was already planning to use against me. Every deed, every account, every physical asset tied to that property would transfer out of my name and into Larkhaven's before the end of that same business day. I signed page after page with a hand that for the first time in weeks did not need to fake its trembling. It trembled because I understood, fully and completely, that I was crossing a line I could never quietly walk back across. "Once this is filed," Foster said, sliding the final document across the desk toward me, There is no version of the story where you quietly change your mind in 6 months. Are you absolutely certain? I thought of Genevra's voice on that recording. He's always gone quietly. That's the whole point of him. I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life, I said, and I signed the last page without a single moment of hesitation. By that evening, the deed to 2.5 acres and a $2,500,000 colonial belonged legally to a holding company my daughter had never once heard of. I placed the original documents inside a safe deposit box at a bank branch 14 miles from home, in a suburb Genevra had never visited in her life, and rode a second car service quietly back toward the estate before Rhett's regular Friday poker game let out for the night. I walked back through the guest house door at 6:47 p.m., hung up my coat exactly where it always hung, and shuffled into the main kitchen wearing precisely the same slightly bewildered expression I had practiced in the mirror that morning. Genevra glanced up briefly from her phone, saw nothing but a tired, confused old man standing quietly in the doorway, and went right back to scrolling. She had no idea the war was already over. She simply hadn't been told the results yet, and I intended to choose exactly when and exactly how she finally would be. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in exactly the kind of warmth designed to make betrayal easier to swallow. Genevra had spent the entire week planning what she called an intimate family gathering, though I understood by then precisely what it actually was. A stage set, built with the same care I once put into a lobby designed to impress investors before they'd even seen the actual blueprints of the building they were funding. She hung fresh garlands along the main staircase. She hired a small catering company to handle the appetizers. She invited 4 neighboring couples, exactly the kind of people who would later describe, without ever being asked, what a devoted, loving daughter she had always been to her poor, declining father. I sat through nearly 2 hours of that performance in a wingback chair near the fireplace, nodding along vaguely at conversations I only half followed, letting my hand tremble very slightly around a champagne flute I barely touched, watching snow gather against the tall windows Margaret had once chosen for exactly this kind of gathering, all those years ago. At one point, in front of everyone, Genevra crossed the room, knelt beside my chair, and raised her own glass. "To my father," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, her voice catching with what looked, to every single guest in that room, like genuine emotion. 68 years old, and still the strongest man I know." The neighbors applauded softly. Someone said something about how lucky I was to have a daughter like her. A woman I barely knew, from 3 houses down, actually reached over and squeezed my hand, telling me I should be proud. I smiled, thanked her, and inside that smile, I felt something colder than the wind rattling the windows outside, something that had nothing at all to do with the fireplace burning 6 feet away from me. She had no idea I had already seen what was sitting at the bottom of her designer handbag 2 days earlier, hung carelessly over the back of a dining chair, its corner visible beneath a stack of holiday cards she hadn't gotten around to mailing yet. I had glimpsed the manila folder while helping myself to a tissue for an entirely unrelated reason, and beneath it, unmistakably, the header of a notarized medical form bearing Dr. Sylvester Kane's forged signature, the ink still crisp enough to look recently printed. By 9:30, the guests had gone home, full of wine and admiration for a family they believed they understood completely. The moment the front door closed behind the last departing couple, the temperature in that house changed instantly, the way a room changes the second a furnace shuts off in the middle of a Chicago winter. Rhett produced a bottle of scotch from the study and poured himself a heavy glass without offering me one, without even glancing my way. Genevra sat down across from me at the long dining table, and for the first time all evening, her performance of warmth simply evaporated, replaced by something businesslike, efficient, almost bored, as though she were closing out a routine transaction. A third person arrived shortly after, a man Rhett introduced only as a friend who can help us handle some paperwork tonight. A notary, named Desmond Fairbank, a business associate of Rhett's, whose license, I would later learn from Foster, had already been quietly flagged for review in 2 separate counties for exactly this kind of arrangement. Genevra placed the folder on the table between us and opened it with the same careful reverence a surgeon might use opening an instrument tray before an operation. Inside sat the power of attorney, its language dense and deliberately confusing, granting whoever held it full authority over my medical decisions, my finances, and, buried in a single clause near the bottom, worded so blandly that I doubted any one of the 4 wine-warm neighbors from that evening would ever have caught it on a first reading. Full authority to sell or transfer any real property registered under my name. "Dad," Genevra's voice softened again, sliding effortlessly back into character, tears rising in her eyes with a precision that would have impressed any professional actress I'd ever hired for a corporate presentation video. "You're getting weaker. We've all seen it happen these past few weeks, all of us. I just need you to let me handle things for you now. The medical decisions, the money, all of it. So that when you forget something important, I'm already legally able to step in and protect you. This is me taking care of you, Dad. This is what love actually looks like, whether you can see that right now or not." I looked at my daughter across that table, in the soft yellow light of a chandelier Margaret had personally chosen 20 years earlier, and I searched her face for even the smallest trace of the little girl who used to hand me wrenches in my old workshop, grinning up at me from beneath a hard hat 3 sizes too large for her tiny head. I could not find her anywhere in that face. What I found instead, staring back at me with wet, glistening eyes, was pure, uncomplicated greed, polished smooth by years of practice until it could pass, in low enough light, for love. Rhett slid a pen across the table toward me, without a word, without even looking up from his glass. Desmond Fairbank uncapped his notary stamp and waited, visibly bored, checking his watch twice in under a minute, clearly eager to be somewhere else on Christmas Eve. This was the moment. Everything Foster and I had built over the previous 9 days existed for exactly this single, narrow window of time. I picked up the pen with a hand I let shake, deliberately and visibly, letting the tip skate slightly off the line before correcting itself, the way a genuinely frightened, genuinely diminished old man's hand might move under pressure. I watched Genevra's eyes flick toward Rhett, a flash of pure triumph passing silently between them that they both believed I was far too gone to notice. I signed my name, Osgood Fenn, in the unsteady, wavering script I had practiced privately for exactly this occasion, knowing full well, with a calm certainty that felt almost peaceful, that the paper beneath my pen was already worth nothing at all. The property it claimed to control had belonged legally to Larkhaven Holdings, LLC, for 9 full days already, since long before this folder had ever left her handbag. Desmond Fairbank stamped the document without asking a single verifying question, collected a thick envelope of cash from Rhett that nobody even bothered to hide from me, and left within minutes, whistling something under his breath as he pulled on his coat. Genevra folded the power of attorney back into its manila folder with trembling, victorious hands, kissed the top of my head the way you might pat a dog that had just performed an especially difficult trick correctly, and told me gently to get some rest, dear. It's been a long night for you. I retreated to the guest house that night and sat by the window for a long time, watching snow gather on the sill, listening to the muffled, celebratory laughter drifting from the main house long after midnight, 2 glasses clinking together somewhere behind those warm, glowing windows I no longer had any claim to at all. By morning, the scale of their confidence had become almost breathtaking to witness. Over coffee, I overheard Rhett on the phone with an unlicensed real estate broker he'd apparently found online, someone willing to move a property quickly and quietly, without asking too many questions about its ownership history, already discussing a motivated seller discount to expedite a private sale before the new year began. That same afternoon, Genevra drove out, without even bothering to invite me along to see it, to place a $2,000 deposit on a single room at Meadowbrook Pines, a state-subsidized care facility 2 counties away, carrying the lowest inspection rating in the entire region. The kind of place, Foster would later confirm for me, that had been formally cited 11 separate times in 3 years for documented neglect of its residents. They believed, completely and without a shred of doubt, that they had won. They believed the frail, forgetful old man upstairs had signed away the last of his usefulness and would simply fade quietly into whatever fluorescent-lit room they eventually chose for him, without protest, without complication. They had no idea that the signature they were celebrating so loudly was worth exactly as much as the paper it was printed on, and that the real document, the one that actually mattered, had been sitting in a bank vault 14 miles away since the 15th of December, patiently waiting for the 14 days it would take to bury their entire scheme once and for all under its own considerable weight. The days between Christmas and New Year's Eve passed for me with the strange, suspended calm of a man standing at the top of a building he has already decided to demolish, waiting only for the crew to arrive on schedule, checking his watch without any real urgency. Genevra and Rhett moved through the house with a lightness I hadn't seen from either of them in years, practically giddy with a future they believed was already secured. I listened to them on the phone, in hushed, excited tones, discussing school districts in a wealthier suburb further north, a place I recognized as considerably out of their reach on paper, unless they were counting, very specifically, on money that had never once been theirs to spend in the first place. I said nothing. I shuffled through the kitchen each morning in my slippers, poured my own tea, now that I no longer needed to fake drinking anyone else's, and let them believe fully in the frail, cooperative version of me they had worked so hard to manufacture over the previous 3 weeks of careful, patient theater. But behind that performance, Foster Whitaker and I were quietly finishing the second and final phase of the plan. A standard sale of the property, even one processed quickly through a normal buyer, would have given Genevra and Rhett something I refused to hand them under any circumstances: time. Time to find a sympathetic lawyer willing to work on contingency. Time to contest the trust transfer in probate court by claiming coercion or fraud on my part. Time to drag this entire situation into exactly the kind of drawn-out, emotionally manipulative legal battle Foster had warned me about from our very first meeting. The kind where a judge, faced with an elderly man on paper and a tearful, well-rehearsed daughter in the courtroom, might grant a temporary stay simply out of caution, simply to be safe. An individual trying to evict a blood relative from a family home almost always finds the legal system moving at a crawl, weighed down by sympathy, procedure, and precisely the kind of narrative Genevra had already begun rehearsing at every dinner party for months, long before Christmas Eve ever arrived. A corporation evicting unauthorized occupants from its own newly acquired commercial asset moves at an entirely different speed altogether, unburdened by any of that sympathy. "There's a firm I've worked with before," Foster told me during our final meeting in his office, sliding a thin folder across the desk toward me. "Vantage Point Acquisitions. They specialize in exactly this: fast, all-cash residential purchases, closings completed in under 48 hours, and a legal department that treats every square foot of every property they touch as a hard asset. Nothing more, nothing sentimental about it whatsoever. No delay. If Larkhaven sells directly to them, at a fair discount for the speed involved, Vantage Point becomes the legal owner of that house almost overnight, and anyone still living inside it instantly becomes, in the eyes of the law, simply an unauthorized occupant of corporate property, with none of the protections a family member might otherwise be able to claim in front of a sympathetic judge." "How much of a discount are we talking about?" I asked. 20% below market value gets it done in 48 hours, guaranteed, in writing, with a penalty clause if they miss it. Otherwise, it's the standard 30 to 45-day close, which gives your daughter exactly the window of time neither of us wants to give her. I did the math without needing a calculator, the way I once priced out steel tonnage on a job site in my head without breaking stride. 20% of $25,000 was a price I was more than willing to pay for speed, for certainty, for the particular satisfaction of knowing that once this sale closed, no amount of tears at any courthouse could slow it down even slightly. Family is slow to evict family. A corporation with an entire legal department on permanent retainer does not care whose name used to be printed on the mailbox or whose Christmas cards used to hang above that mailbox every December. I authorized the sale that same afternoon, signing the final authorization at Foster's desk without a moment's hesitation, my hand perfectly steady for the first time in weeks. Larkhaven Holdings, LLC transferred the deed to Vantage Point Acquisitions within 48 hours, exactly as Foster had promised, the paperwork moving through the county recorder's office with the quiet, mechanical efficiency of a transaction between two entities that had done this exact thing 100 times before and felt absolutely nothing about doing it 101st time. The house I had lived beside for 10 years, the house I had personally paid for in full, in cash, was no longer on paper connected to my family in any way whatsoever. That evening, I began packing. It struck me, standing alone in the small guest house bedroom, that I did not own a single suitcase that reflected who I actually was anymore. Everything I owned had been chosen years earlier by a version of myself who dressed for other people's comfort rather than his own, who bought practical things in sensible colors because practical, sensible things never demanded an explanation from anyone at the dinner table. I drove to a small boutique men's shop 2 towns over, a place I'd walked past 100 times without ever once going inside, and bought, deliberately and without a shred of guilt, a set of soft leather luggage, 3 cashmere sweaters in colors Margaret would have loved, and a wristwatch I had admired quietly in a catalog for over a year and never once let myself purchase. It felt less like indulgence and more like restitution, the first payment on a debt I had apparently been owed by myself for a very long time. I booked a one-way business class ticket to San Francisco, with a connection to a private car service arranged to carry me south, along the coast to Carmel by the Sea, to a furnished apartment I had leased under Larkhaven's name, sight unseen except for a handful of photographs overlooking a stretch of Pacific coastline I had never once visited in 68 years of living almost entirely for other people's comfort instead of my own. On the morning I left, the house was quiet before sunrise, exactly the way I had planned for it to be. Genevra and Rhett were still asleep upstairs, dreaming, I imagined, of the wealthier suburb they believed they were about to move into within the month. I set my carefully packed suitcase by the guest house door, walked once, slowly, through the main house I had paid for in full and would never again set foot inside, and placed a single sealed envelope on the kitchen island, propped carefully against the crystal vase that had once belonged to Margaret's mother, positioned exactly where I knew it would be impossible for either of them to miss it. I did not write a long letter. I had learned over 3 weeks of watching my daughter perform grief and gratitude in equal practiced measure that long explanations only ever give people more material to twist into something more sympathetic to themselves. Inside that envelope sat a single printed page, a complete, itemized accounting of every dollar I had spent on their behalf across 10 years, down to the cent, alongside a short, unsentimental note I had drafted and redrafted a dozen times until every unnecessary word had been carefully stripped away. I looked at that envelope for a long moment in the gray pre-dawn light, then walked out the front door for the last time, my new leather suitcase rolling smoothly and silently behind me. Across the driveway I had personally paid to repave 5 years earlier for a family that had never once thanked me for it, not once, not even in passing. The car was already waiting exactly on schedule. I did not look back at the house, not even once. I remember standing there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the house creak the way old houses do in deep cold, and thinking that even its bones sounded relieved to finally be rid of us both. I had spent 41 years of my career designing buildings meant to be looked at, admired, and remembered. This particular structure, the one built entirely out of obligation and quiet, accumulating resentment, I was finally gladly willing to leave behind, without a single backward glance. By the time Genevra woke that morning to an empty guest house and a strange car already parked in the driveway of what she still believed, with complete confidence, was her home, I would already be 30,000 feet above the Rocky Mountains, heading steadily west toward an ocean that had waited an entire lifetime for me to finally, truly arrive. I learned what happened next only secondhand, first from Foster in a brief phone call 2 days later, and afterward in far more detail from the county sheriff's public incident report, which Foster forwarded to me without comment several days after it was formally filed. I read it twice, slowly, sitting somewhere the Chicago cold could no longer reach me, and I will admit that I felt something closer to quiet vindication than triumph, though the two feelings sit closer together than most people realize. Genevra and Rhett hosted their own New Year's Eve celebration exactly as I had privately expected they would. They invited nearly 30 guests, filled the main house with hired caterers and a string quartet Rhett had arranged specifically for the occasion, and spent the entire evening, according to at least 2 neighbors who later spoke with the responding deputies, loudly announcing to anyone who would listen that they would soon be selling this house and relocating to a far more exclusive address further north. Genevra reportedly told one couple, standing near the very same fireplace, where she had once knelt beside my chair and toasted my health on Christmas Eve, that her father's health had sadly declined to the point where difficult decisions had become necessary, and that she was simply doing what any devoted daughter would do under the circumstances. Several guests, according to the report, offered her sympathetic hugs. One woman reportedly cried a little herself, dabbing at her eyes with a cocktail napkin. She had no idea, standing there in her black cocktail dress, with a glass of champagne balanced elegantly in one hand, that the difficult decision she was describing so gracefully to her guests had already been made for her, in full, 9 days before she had ever placed a pen in my trembling hand. At 11:40 p.m., 40 minutes before the countdown to midnight, the doorbell rang. It was not, as Genevra apparently assumed, for one confused, hopeful instant, a late-arriving guest bringing champagne. Standing on the front steps, according to the report, were a Cook County Sheriff's deputy and 2 attorneys from Vantage Point Acquisitions, dressed in dark, unremarkable suits, holding a formal notice to quit, along with certified copies of the recorded deed transfer. The music inside stopped almost immediately. 30 guests mid-celebration went suddenly silent as the deputy read the notice aloud in the doorway, plainly enough for the entire front hall to hear every single word. The property had been legally sold on December 17th. The current occupants had exactly 72 hours to vacate, and any personal belongings remaining after that window would be removed by court order and placed in public storage at the occupant's own considerable expense. Genevra, according to 2 separate witness statements collected that night, ran upstairs and returned within minutes, clutching the same manila folder containing the power of attorney she had celebrated so triumphantly just 9 days earlier. She reportedly waved it directly in front of one of the Vantage Point attorneys, her voice rising loud enough that several departing guests could hear her clearly all the way from the driveway. "I have the legal right to make decisions about this property," she said, according to the report. "I have power of attorney. My father is not well. You cannot do this to us on New Year's Eve, of all nights." The attorney's response, according to the deputy's written report, was delivered without ever raising his voice, without a flicker of sympathy. "Ma'am, this power of attorney is dated December 24th. This property was legally transferred into an irrevocable trust on December 15th, 9 full days earlier. Your father owned nothing personally by the time you obtained his signature. This document has no legal authority over this address whatsoever. You have 72 hours to vacate a property belonging to Vantage Point Acquisitions, or the Sheriff's Department will remove your belongings and place them in public storage at your own expense. Genevra reportedly sat down on the cold front steps of the house in her black cocktail dress in the middle of a Chicago winter night and did not move for nearly 20 minutes while the remaining guests quietly gathered their coats from the hall closet and left one by one without bothering to say goodbye to their host. Rhett, according to a neighbor's statement, stood frozen in the doorway the entire time, still holding an unfinished glass of scotch, saying absolutely nothing at all. It was well past 2 a.m., after the last guest had gone, and Rhett had reportedly made 3 increasingly desperate phone calls to lawyers who each declined the case within minutes of hearing the trust's filing date, that Genevra finally walked back into the kitchen and noticed the crystal vase sitting slightly askew on the island, the sealed envelope, propped against its base, exactly where I had left it 4 days earlier. I do not know, and will never know, exactly what her face looked like as she opened it. I have only my imagination, and the itemized page I know she found waiting inside. A single-sheet listing, in plain, unembellished columns, $287,000 in mortgage assistance, $18,000 in credit card settlements, $23,000 in emergency loans, private school tuition payments, medical bills from 3 separate years, and a dozen smaller sums that had never once been repaid or even quietly acknowledged across 10 patient years of my life. Beneath the numbers in my own steady handwriting sat the note I had drafted and redrafted a dozen times until every unnecessary word had been carefully stripped away, leaving only the parts that mattered. Genevra and Rhett, by the time you read this, I am already gone, though not the way you both were hoping for on Thanksgiving. I paid off every dollar tied to this house long before you ever placed a pen in my hand on Christmas Eve. You told your friends I had lost my mind. I remember every single cent I ever spent on the 2 of you, and I remember in perfect detail exactly what you planned to do to me the moment I stopped being useful to either of you. The power of attorney you're holding is worth exactly nothing, but you're welcome to keep it anyway. Perhaps it can help settle whatever remains of Rhett's debt. I hope the fresh start you were both so eager for finds you quickly wherever you land. Signed, the man you both believed had already lost his memory. Foster told me 3 days later that Rhett's lender had already been in contact through an intermediary and that the 72-hour eviction deadline had passed without either of them securing so much as a single hotel room. Their joint accounts, flagged and frozen the moment the fraudulent power of attorney had been formally reported to the county, remained locked, pending review. Neither of them, as far as Foster's contact at the Sheriff's Department could confirm, had anywhere left to go by the time the deputies returned to enforce the notice on schedule. I read all of this alone, on a private balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean, 2,000 miles away, with a glass of wine slowly warming in my hand and a stretch of golden California sunlight settling gently across water that had never once, in its entire existence, asked anything at all of me. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I promised myself, somewhere over the Rocky Mountains on the flight out, that I would not lie to myself about any of this the way I had spent 10 years lying to myself about what my own family actually thought of me. I did not feel joy, not the clean, uncomplicated kind you might expect from a man watching his betrayers finally receive exactly what they had engineered for someone else. What I felt, reading that report line by line in the quiet California sun, was something closer to grief laced with relief. Grief for the daughter I had genuinely believed existed for 42 years, and relief that I had finally stopped paying, in every sense of that word, to keep believing in a version of her that had apparently stopped being real long before that Ring camera ever recorded a single word of the truth. Somewhere back in Illinois, in a house that no longer belonged to either of them, my daughter was sitting with an itemized accounting of every sacrifice I'd ever made for her, finally forced to see, in cold, undeniable numbers, exactly what her contempt had cost her. I had not written that letter out of cruelty. I had written it because, after 10 years of being underestimated, I wanted the last thing my daughter ever heard from me to be the plain, unarguable truth. Nothing dressed up, nothing softened, nothing left for her to twist into a more comfortable story later, whenever she finally told it to someone else. The numbers did not lie. They never had. It was, in the end, the only language I had left that I trusted her to actually understand, the only language she had ever truly respected. The Pacific did not care that my daughter was screaming into a telephone 2,000 miles away. It simply kept doing what it had done for millions of years before Genevra was born, and would keep doing long after both of us were dust. Rolling in, folding over itself, retreating, rolling in again, patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the small human catastrophes unfolding on either side of it. I sat on the balcony of my new apartment in Carmel by the sea with a glass of Pinot Noir, sweating gently in the evening air, and I watched that endless, indifferent rhythm, and I thought, this is what freedom actually looks like. Not fireworks, not a parade, just water that keeps its promises, over and over, without ever once needing to be asked twice. The apartment behind me was nothing like the guest house I had spent 10 years pretending was enough for a man who once designed buildings that touched the sky, polished concrete floors, cool under bare feet, even in the evening warmth, floor-to-ceiling glass that turned every sunset into an event, a kitchen island made of a single slab of honed granite that had cost more than most people's cars, and that I had chosen myself, in person, without asking anyone's opinion first. I had not chosen any of it because I needed to prove anything to anyone, least of all myself. I had chosen it because, for the first time since Margaret died, I was finally allowed to want something simply because I wanted it, with no one left to explain the expense to over dinner. My phone buzzed on the glass table beside me. Not the old number, that one was dead, drowned in the Pacific along with the SIM card I'd snapped in half at the airport in Chicago before I ever boarded the plane. This was the new number, the clean number, and only 3 people on Earth had it. One of them was calling now. "Foster," I said, answering on the second ring. "Osgood." My lawyer's voice carried that particular note of controlled amusement I'd come to recognize over the past 3 weeks, the sound of a man watching a plan detonate exactly as designed, down to the last decimal. "I have an update. You're going to want to be sitting down, though from what I understand, you're already sitting somewhere with a view. Tell me, your daughter called my office 11 times today." "11, Osgood." My assistant finally had to block the number entirely. "She's also called 2 other firms in Chicago, both of which turned her down within the hour, once they pulled the property records and saw the trust filing date sitting right there in black and white." I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, the way I used to let silence stretch across a construction site before delivering bad news to a subcontractor who'd cut corners on rebar he thought no one would ever inspect closely. Silence was a tool. I had learned that from 30 years of blueprints and budgets. The man who speaks first in a negotiation is always, without exception, the man who has already lost. "Vantage Point closed on the property 9 days ago, exactly as we structured it," Foster continued. "The sheriff's department served the notice to quit on New Year's Eve, right in the middle of their own party. 72 hours, Osgood. 72 hours, and your daughter and her husband became legal trespassers on a corporate asset in their own former dining room. And the accounts? Frozen the moment the power of attorney was flagged as fraudulently obtained. Rhett's business account is also under review after the notary's license came up suspended in 2 counties simultaneously. They have, as of this afternoon, $412 between them, combined. That's the entire liquid net worth of both households. $412. I turned that number over in my mind the way I used to turn over a flawed foundation calculation, checking it again, marveling at how something built on so much greed could collapse so completely, so fast, under its own accumulated weight. "She's telling people I did this to her," Foster said, "that her father had a psychotic break, that he abandoned a sick, elderly man's estate to strangers out of spite. She's telling the story backwards, Osgood, and it isn't landing anywhere she takes it, because the paperwork doesn't lie. The power of attorney is dated the 24th. The trust transfer is dated the 15th. 9 days. That's the gap they can't explain away, no matter how many tears she cries, in front of whichever judge finally agrees to hear her." I closed my eyes. 9 days. 9 days that I had spent trembling on cue, calling my son-in-law by the wrong name, letting a cup of tea I'd secretly poured down the drain sit cold and untouched on the counter, while my daughter and her husband congratulated each other with their eyes across the dinner table, certain, absolutely certain, that they had finally won. They had not won. They had signed a death warrant for their own scheme and handed it to me themselves, with a smile, on Christmas Eve of all nights. "How are they holding up?" I asked, and I was surprised by how flat my own voice sounded. Not cruel, not gleeful, just flat. The way a man sounds when he is reading a weather report about a storm that is no longer, in any meaningful sense, his problem. "Not well," Foster admitted. "My understanding, second-hand through the property manager who let the sheriff's deputies in, is that there was a great deal of shouting. Your daughter apparently produced the power of attorney and waved it at the Vantage Point attorneys, insisting she had the legal right to remain in the house. One of them told her in front of witnesses that the document was, and I'm quoting the deputy's report here, word for word, worthless paper. She reportedly sat down on the front steps of the house and did not move for 20 minutes in her cocktail dress in the middle of winter. I pictured it. I let myself picture it, just once, just for a moment, the way you let yourself look directly at the sun before you know better. Genevra on the cold stone steps of a house she no longer owned, the December wind cutting through a coat she'd bought with money that used to be mine, holding a piece of paper that meant nothing at all, that had never meant anything at all. I did not feel joy. That surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. I had expected joy, or at least its shabby cousin, satisfaction. What I felt instead was something quieter and stranger, the particular stillness of a man setting down a weight he has carried for so long that his shoulders had genuinely forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight without it. "Thank you, Foster. Keep me updated only if something changes materially. Otherwise, I don't need the details. I've heard enough of this particular story." "Understood." And Osgood, for what it's worth, in 22 years of practicing law, I've never seen a man execute a counter-move this clean. Most people, when they find out what you found out on that security footage, they get angry. They confront. They yell. You didn't yell once, not a single time, in 3 weeks. "Yelling," I said, "is what people do when they still believe the other person is listening. I stopped believing that the moment I heard my own daughter call me a liability on a recording she didn't even know existed." We said our goodbyes. I set the phone face down on the glass table and looked back out at the water, letting the conversation settle somewhere behind me. 68 years old. For most of my life, I had believed that number carried a kind of sentence with it, a countdown, a diminishing, a slow surrender of relevance dressed up politely as retirement. Genevra had certainly believed it. She had looked at 68 and seen an old man's mind ready to be declared unsound, an old man's signature ready to be forged onto whatever document served her purposes, an old man's house ready to be liquidated for whatever debts her husband had accumulated at whatever card table he'd been quietly losing at for years. She had been wrong about all of it. 68 was not old. 68, I had learned over these 3 impossible weeks, was simply the age at which a man finally has enough evidence, enough scar tissue, and enough quiet fury to stop being generous with people who mistake generosity for weakness, and start being generous for once with himself instead. I thought about the buildings I had designed across 4 decades. The glass and steel tower on Michigan Avenue that still bore my original signature in the architect's registry. The community library in Evanston that had won an award I no longer remembered the name of. The hospital wing that had taken 3 years and nearly broken my marriage before it ever broke ground. I had once believed those were my legacy. The proof that Osgood Fenn had mattered had built something that would outlast him by decades, maybe centuries. I understood now that I had been wrong about that too. Buildings can be sold. Buildings can be gutted and renovated by strangers who never knew your name and never asked. Buildings, in the end, are just stone and steel, arranged in a shape that pleases the eye for a little while until fashion changes and someone tears them down anyway. My real legacy, the only structure I had ever built that truly mattered in the end, was the one I had just finished demolishing. The cage. The quiet, comfortable, decades-long cage that a family builds around a man who is too kind, too dependable, too easily convinced that love means never once saying no. I had designed that cage myself, brick by brick, mortgage payment by mortgage payment, favor by favor, for years without even realizing I was the one laying its foundation with my own 2 hands. And then, on one impossibly cold December night, hidden in a security recording nobody thought I'd ever hear, I had finally seen the blueprint for what it truly was. Tearing it down had not been an act of cruelty. It had been the most honest piece of architecture I had ever produced in 41 years of practicing the craft. No compromise, no client to please, no committee to satisfy, no budget to justify to anyone. Just the clean, ruthless geometry of a man rebuilding himself from the foundation up, using nothing but the truth as his only building material. The wind shifted, carrying salt and the faint sweetness of jasmine from somewhere below the balcony. Down the coast, the lights of the village were beginning to flicker on, warm and gold against the darkening blue of the sky one by one, like a city slowly remembering itself. Somewhere out there, a couple was walking a dog along the shoreline, laughing about something I would never know. Somewhere in Chicago, my daughter was sitting in a stranger's rented room, counting $412 and wondering how, exactly, the man she'd tried so carefully to erase had somehow erased her instead. I picked up my phone one final time, not to call anyone, not to check on anyone. I opened the airline app I had downloaded 2 days earlier, the one still holding an unfinished search for flights out of San Francisco. Lisbon, Florence, Vienna. Cities I had sketched from photographs in architecture textbooks 40 years ago, and never once found the time or the permission to actually visit in person. I scrolled through the options slowly, unhurried, the way a man moves when nobody's waiting for him to hurry up, when nobody's calling from another room asking what's taking so long. Then I selected a flight, business class, departing in 9 days, no return date attached, because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not need to know when I was coming back, or whether I was coming back at all. I set the phone down, powered it off completely, and let the silence of the evening settle over the balcony, like a blanket pulled up against the cold. The ocean kept rolling in. The lights of the village kept glowing, warmer now, closer together. And I sat there, 68 years old, utterly alone and utterly at peace, finally free, watching the last of the daylight disappear into water that had waited an entire lifetime for me, and had never once, in all that waiting, asked me to hurry. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about it in the comments below. To watch the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.